Hello everyone, welcome to Bicycle Maintenance 101. We're doing a virtual workshop today as a part of the Sustainable September. Bikes are a great way to be sustainable because of course they're zero emissions vehicles, and if you know how to maintain and take care of your bike, you can make it last longer, and that makes it even more sustainable. So my name is Hank and I'm a mechanic here at the Campus Bike Center. We're located at 51 East Gregory in Champaign, so we're just about a little ways northwest of the Arc, if you know where that is. And today we're going to be walking you through some basics on bicycle maintenance and repair. So what we do here at the Campus Bike Center, it looks a little bit different now with the COVID restrictions, but normally what we have is tools, which you can see on the wall here, and we've got a whole bunch of bike stands. And so you can come in here, and if you have a membership, you can put your bike in one of the stands and get to work doing repairs, maintenance, whatever you need to do. And then the employees are here if you don't know much about bike maintenance or you have a specific problem that you're not able to figure out. We're always here to walk you through whatever it is you need. So the first thing we're going to do is look at some pre-ride checks. So these are some things that you should do before every ride, and for some people it's not practical to do this before every single ride, but you should try to do this on a regular basis. So the first thing is air. You want to make sure your tires are always up to the correct pressure. And if you don't know what pressure you should go to, you can look on the sidewall of your tire, and it should be printed somewhere along there. So if I look at this tire, you can see it says pressure is 40 to 65 psi. So I'll want to put the valve on and then bring it up to 40 to 65. So we can go to the valve, undo it. So we'll remove the cap, and the valves are going to come in two different types. One is Schrader, one is Presta, and I can show you the difference over here. So here's what a Schrader valve looks like. Here's what a Presta valve looks like. So you can see the Schrader valve is wider, and so you want to make sure you take that into account when you fill it up. Most pumps are going to have some system that allows you to do both. So in this case we have two holes. Other systems might have it where you loosen something here and flip a piece around that makes it narrower if you have the Presta. But in this case we have Schrader, so we're going to use the wider of the two holes. You're going to press it down, and then you're going to lock it into place. And it may vary for your pump, but for this one you pull it away from the tire and that locks it into place. And so now you can begin pumping. And we're going to get it to 40 to 65. It's up to you where you want to be in that range. I'm going to go to 60. And then we can put the cap back on. And it's probably good to mention, we've got the bikes in stands. Most likely you don't have access to your own stand, but this is most of the stuff we're doing today is stuff you can do even without a stand, so you can prop it up against the wall. You can even flip it upside down in the grass. I'll do that sometimes if I don't have access to a stand, and it works just as good. It just makes it a little bit more difficult sometimes. So we'll come over here, and in this case, the tire is completely flat, and this one's been pumped up recently, so we know that it's probably an issue. We probably have a flat inner tube, and so there's probably a hole in it, and we're actually going to address this later. We're going to walk you through the process of that. For now, let's continue on to the bike that we have back here. So this one has the Presta valve before we looked at the Schrader. And this is pretty much the same process. The only thing is that there's this little lock here that you want to undo, because apparently if I tried to pump it up, we're not going to be able to get any air in there. So you have to undo this little valve here. And now you can actually go to inflating it. So we'll use the narrower side. Press it on, lock it into place, and then we'll go up to pressure. And again, we'll want to check what the pressure is on there. For the sake of this, I'm just going to fill it up to 60, but we want to get the exact pressure normally. So once we've done that, we'll want to lock this part that we undid before. That way no air can escape, and then we can put the cat back on. And it's good to know what it feels like also when your tire is up to pressure, because then a lot of times you won't have to check and you'll have a better sense of what's the right pressure for your specific tires. So that is it for air. Now we're going to move on to brakes. So bikes will have a lot of different types of brakes. Some of them are going to be rim brakes, like you see here, where they contact the rim. Some will have disc brakes, where there's a rotor here that gets compressed over there, and then some will even have a coaster brake, which is inside the hub. So we don't have time to cover every type of brake, but we're going to cover two types of rim brakes. So these are called V-brakes, and then the other bike that we'll look at has what's called caliper brakes. So anytime you're dealing with brakes that act on the rim, there's usually going to be three types of adjustments that you can make. So give me a second. So the first is pad placement. So you want to make sure that your pad is always aligned with the rim. So in this case, you can see the pad is sort of crooked. It's sort of sticking off the rim over here, and then here it's up so high that it's just about touching the tire. So we'll want to straighten that out, and in this case we can loosen this here, and once we've loosened that, we can move this pad freely, and then we can align it just visually and tighten it into place. And so now, so now that's looking a lot better than it was before. So that's the first adjustment that you can make on rim brakes, is the pad placement. Another thing you can do is adjust the cable tension. So if I squeeze these brakes right now, it feels really loose, and if I actually run this, it's stopping it, but if I actually had a person on the bike, it wouldn't do that much because it would just have too much momentum. So we'll want to tighten up these brakes, and we do that by introducing more tension in the cable. So I can loosen this bolt here, which holds the cable clamped there, and now I can draw more cable. And then once I've drawn an amount of cable that leaves a little gap between the pads and the rim, I can tighten it back up. And I might not get it the first try, but this is something that you can keep adjusting until you get everything working right. And already that's an improvement. The brakes are a lot tighter now. And sometimes as you do these different adjustments, you might have to come back. So after I add tension, I might come back and realize this wasn't as straight as I thought it was, and I might have to adjust that some more. So we've looked at two adjustments, pad placement and cable tension. The last one is the actual centering of the brake pads. So sometimes they might be tight enough and placed right, but the whole system is leaning out in this direction, and so you have one pad that's rubbing up against the rim, whereas this pad has a huge gap, and you can't fix that with either of the adjustments we've talked about. So that is where centering comes into play. And so there's a screw here which pushes up against a spring. There's also a screw here which pushes up against a spring on this side, so you can control the tension in each of these arms. And this one's actually set correctly already, but we can take a look at the front. And here's a good example, because we got this pad is rubbing up against there. You can even hear it. And then on this side we have a big gap. And so what we want to do is we want to introduce more spring tension on this side so that it pulls it outward. So to introduce more spring tension, you can tighten this screw here. And then once you've made a small adjustment, maybe a one turn, you can squeeze the brakes again. And that didn't seem to work, so we can tighten it up even more. Squeeze again, and now we're starting to get some better results. So now we can let the tire go, and there's no rubbing up against the rim on either side. And the gap between the brakes and the rim looks about even on each side. So those are the 3 adjustments, and like I said, you might have to go through those again because they're sort of all interdependent on each other. But then if we take a look at this system here, it looks a lot different. This is the caliper brakes. What we looked at before was V brakes. But even though it's sort of different, we have the basic principles again. So you can adjust pad placement using these nuts here, and then so you can loosen that, adjust. Then we have the cable tension. So again, we have a bolt here that you can loosen, and then you can pull out whatever cable you need to get the right tension. And then for centering, that's where it's a little bit different. But what we have is up here is actually where you do the centering. So you can put a tool back here, and then you can loosen here. And then you can sort of adjust how this is centered. And then once you get it centered, you tighten it back up. So in this case, I think we have the right amount of cable tension, but we've got this pad, it was just a little crooked. So we might want to loosen that, straighten it out, tighten it back up. And then this one seems to be good to go now. And up here, we're pretty off-centered. We've got a big gap on this side, and this side is actually rubbing. So what we can do is adjust back here. I'm just going to loosen it a little bit. And now we've actually got a gap on both sides, and this brake is working well again too. So that covers it for brakes. You might have different brakes, but if it's rim brakes, it should operate on the same 3 different adjustments that we talked about: brake pad positioning, cable tension, and centering. If you have more specific brakes, like disc brakes, you might need to take it into a bike shop or do a bit of research on your own to figure out what exactly is the problem with yours. So now that we've covered brakes, we can talk about your chain. This is another thing that you want to maintain regularly. You want to make sure it's lubricated. Otherwise, it'll start to rust up and your bike won't run smoothly anymore. And in this case, the chain is fine. It doesn't need to be lubricated, but we'll go ahead and walk through that process anyway. So the first thing you want to do is take any existing grease off of it. So we're going to clean it basically. And what you can use to do that is WD-40, which you can find at Walmart or most stores. And so we'll want to go through and get a bunch of WD-40 on there. And then we'll go through with alright, yeah, so we'll go through and we'll clean off the chain. Get all of the lubricant off of it. And you might even want to use a brush for this if you want to clean it more thoroughly. Now, if I was doing this for real, I'd probably clean that up some more, but for the sake of this little workshop, we'll just consider that good enough, and now we'll add the new lubricant. So you can find lubricant at Walmart or Meijer, most stores, but what we're using is something called Tri-Flow, but you can find other lubricants in the bike section at a lot of stores. So we're just going to put a drop of lubricant on each link. So I'm going through, putting one drop on each link. So I haven't done all of them, but once you get all of them, you can run your chain around a bit more, kind of get it going again. And that'll do it for lubricating your chain. If your chain is especially rusty or old, you're probably better off just replacing it. So you could find a new chain or take it into a bike shop. So if it's too rusted, also sometimes it'll sort of get stretched out, and they actually have tools where you can measure to see if your chain is too stretched out or if it's still good enough to keep on your bike. But we won't get into chain replacing today unless we have a lot of extra time, but we'll go ahead and move on. So next we'll talk about shifting. So we'll talk about how you make sure your bike is set up right to go through the different gears. So shifting is important so that you can have your bike optimized for going up hills and then switch it into a different gear if you're going downhill or if you're going into the wind. It allows you to control a lot about how difficult it is to pedal versus how much rotation of your wheel you're getting for each pedal rotation. So when we talk about shifting, up here on the handlebars, the part that actually controls, or the part that you control I should say, that's called the shifter. And then the parts that actually are on the bike that push the chain between the different gears, those are called derailleurs. So we have a rear derailleur here. And so you can see when I push it, it moves the chain to the different gears, and that's basically all you're doing when you activate the shifter, is you're pulling a cable that pushes this in and out. And then we have the front derailleur, which basically does the same thing, but it's just shaped a bit differently. It's got this cage that wraps around the chain, and then it can get pushed outward and get pulled back inward. So when we're doing shifting, there are usually two adjustments that we talk about, and one is indexing and the other is limits adjustment. So the first thing we'll talk about is limit adjustment. So I'm going to go ahead and shift this bike into the different gears to see how it's doing, and it's really not shifting that well. It's kind of slow going between the gears. Sometimes I click it and it doesn't even change gears, and if I try to go down to this lowest gear, it's not even getting there. So that means we're going to have to do a little bit of maintenance on this to get it working again. So the first thing I described is that it's not actually going down to this smallest gear, which we call the high gear. And that's because of the limit screws. So there's two limit screws, one there, and there's usually a label for H and L. I'm not sure if you can see it on here, but in this case, this top one is H, this bottom one is L. That stands for high and low. So in this case, I can't get to the highest gear. So that means that my H screw is too tight. So these screws basically limit how far this derailleur can get pushed this way, and they limit how far it can get pulled back out in this direction. So it's not able to pull out any further in this direction, so that limit must be too tight. So I can loosen it. I'll just loosen it a tiny bit. and then we can see again if we can get there. So we're still not getting there. I'll loosen it a little bit more. Still nothing. Alright, so I think we're getting there now. So that's good. And generally we want this screw to be as tight as it can be while still allowing us to get through all of the gears smoothly. So now that we've got that set, we'll check the gears again. And they're working okay, but it's sort of slow to shift down through them. It's sort of skipping around. So that's where I'm going to want to make an indexing adjustment. And a lot of bikes will have a barrel adjuster that lets you do this easily. So I've got this barrel, and if I loosen this barrel like this, I'm basically tightening the cable because the cable will have a longer path that it has to travel through. And then if I tighten this, I'm loosening the cable because the cable will have a shorter path to follow. So the hard part is figuring out if you're supposed to tighten it or loosen it. So let's see. Yeah, so I just shifted what was supposed to be up and it didn't move. So that means that I need to loosen the cable some more. So I'm going to tighten the barrel adjuster. And that can get kind of confusing, but you can make small adjustments at a time to make sure you're doing it right. So there I just made a small adjustment, and now it's a little bit better, but I think I'm gonna loosen the cable some more. Try it again. Still a little slow getting there. I'll loosen the cable some more. Alright, and that's working pretty good now. I could probably adjust it a little bit more if I wanted to get going perfect, but I think that is good enough. And then on the front derailleur, it's going to be a similar process. So you'll have a screw here and a screw there. These are H and O. And again, you'll have a barrel adjuster. In this case, we don't have one here, but sometimes you'll have one up at the actual shifter on the handlebars. So I could use this as well. So if we look at the front shifter, it's sort of rubbing up here, which means I probably want to either make a limit adjustment or an indexing adjustment. But in this case, if I try to go higher, this thing is actually able to push out more if I pull out cable. So it's not being limited by one of these screws. It's just that there's not enough cable tension. So I'm going to bring in some tension by loosening the barrel adjuster here. And now that rubbing is gone. Alright, so we've looked at shifting on this bike. We'll take a look at the other bike. It's more or less the same, but this bike, we actually don't have the indexing part of things. We just have the limit screws, because this bike has what's called friction shifters. So rather than going through different clicks, it just is continuously able to move. So you can precisely control how far in or out your chain is, rather than having it sit at a predetermined index. And if I shift this all the way up, let's see if it's working all right. Alright, so here we have the cable just completely loose when we bring the shifter all the way here. So what we need to do is draw out some cable here. So I'm going to loosen this pinch bolt, pull out some cable. Then tighten this back so the cable stays at the amount I pulled it. And now we can check again, and this time we're actually able to shift to all the gears. But one thing is that if we keep shifting, the chain is actually going so far that it's almost coming off the gear here. And if we let it go, then we actually get the chain stuck in between the gears and the bike. And you obviously don't want that, especially if you're out riding. So we'll go ahead and put it back. And as we described earlier, that's going to have to do with the limit adjustment. So in this case, it was going past the lowest gear. So that means we didn't limit enough in the low direction. So we'll want to tighten the low limit screw. So look at these. This top one is the low limit. So we're going to tighten that a bit more. And now no matter how hard I pull on the shifter, we're not going to get it past that lowest gear, past that biggest gear. And then the front shifter seems to be working fine on this bike. No issues there. So that'll wrap it up for shifting. Next, we're going to talk about this tube. I mentioned earlier that this one is completely flat, and it was also pumped up recently. So that tells us that it's probably got a hole inside the tube. So we're going to actually take off the tire and replace the tube. So first thing we want to do is take off the wheel. And if you have a quick release lever like this, you just pull out this lever, and then you can hold one hand here on this end while you loosen this the rest of the way. So actually I'm just going to hold under this side and loosen it from the right. Okay. So I didn't take it all the way off, I'm just going to loosen it a little bit. And then the other problem is that we can't get it past the brake pads. So we could just squeeze it and get it through. But in general, what you want to do is actually disengage your brakes. So in the case of V-brakes, you can just pinch this and this piece will come out. And then when you re-engage it later, we can put it back in. So we let that out. And now our brakes are disengaged and the wheel can come out. So when you're taking off a tire, you'll want to make sure that it's flat first, but in this case, we don't need to worry about that. So we're just going to go ahead and take off the tire. Actually, we should just make sure that all of the air is out of it to make things easier. So we can just press down on the valve here with anything that'll fit. I'm just using this wrench. Alright, so we've got the air out of that, and now we'll need a tire lever. So this is a tire lever. It's going to help us pry out this tire and get it off. And these, again, you can find these in the bike section at a lot of stores, and sometimes they'll even come with a tube if you're buying one of those as well. So you're going to peel back the tire, get the tire lever under there, pry it out, and now you can actually push along the circumference of the rim until you've gotten this whole side off. And now you can take the other side off. So we're gonna push, continuing to push in this direction, and the whole tire will come off. And this one's pretty easy. Sometimes it'll be harder, especially if you've got a smaller tire. Like if you have a road bike tire, sometimes those can be a lot more difficult. But this one's pretty easy. And so now that we've got the tire off, we're going to take the tube out as well. And if you're being really thorough, you might even want to make a mark. So you can make a mark on the tire here, and then a mark on the tube. And that way, once you find where the hole is, you can track that back to a location on the tire and see if maybe there was some, things sticking out in there, or there was a piece of gravel that initiated the flat. But we're not going to do that right now. Instead, we can just pull it out, and then we'll inspect the inside of the tire to see if there was anything in there that caused the flat. So this seems to be fine. There's no little rocks or gravel or anything in there. Just a little bit of dirt. So now we'll find a replacement for the tube. You could also patch this. So you can see this one's already been patched once before. So patching it can be a bit cheaper. It can be easier to carry a patch around if you're going on a long ride. But when it comes to actually replacing it, it's easier just to buy a new tube most of the time than to go to the trouble of patching it. So when you're finding a tube, there's 3 things you want to make sure of. The first is the diameter of the tire. So the distance from here to here. And you can find that on the tire. So this one is 26. And it's 26 by 1.95. And when you get the tube, it's not going to say 26 by 1.95. It'll have a range. So in this case, 1.75 at 2.35. But the 1.95 fits in between there. So that means we have the right tube. And then the last thing, the third thing that we want to check is the valve. So as we described earlier, there's Presta valves. There's also Schrader valves. And in this case, our tube that we had before had the Schrader valve. If you have the wrong valve, it might not work with the rim or with the wheel that you're doing because of the size of this hole. So I'm actually not going to open up this tube. We're actually just going to put the same one on just as a demonstration. So let's imagine that this is a tube that we just bought. It's brand new, and we're going to put it on the bike. So the first thing you want to do with your new tube is you'll want to put some air into it. This one already has some air, but if it's a brand new tube, it's going to be empty. And you're not going to want to inflate it up to pressure, of course. You're just going to want to inflate it until it starts to take its shape. Because if this thing is completely deflated, it's going to be hard to fit it inside your tire. But now this has the basic shape of a tire, and no more air than what is needed for that. So we're going to put it inside the tire. Alright. So now we've got our tire and tube, and we've got our wheel. So we'll align the hole that the valve's going to go through with the actual valve. And one other thing that you can sometimes check is the direction of the tire. Some tires they'll recommend that you put it on in a certain direction, which isn't always super important, but you can keep that in mind if you have a tire that's meant to go in a specific direction. This one I can just put on without worrying about that. So I'm lining that up, sticking the valve in, and now I can go around and do the opposite of what we did before. But this time we won't actually need the tire lever. So I'm just going to put on one side. Notice that this whole side is still off. Alright, So we've got this whole side tucked under, and this side is still sticking out. So now we can go along and push this in. And again, this can be more difficult with some tires, but with these big mountain bike tires, it's usually pretty straightforward. Alright, so that is on. The next thing we want to check for is a pinch flap. Oops. This piece fell off here. 1 second. Alright, so the next thing we want to check for is a pinch flap. And a pinch flap is basically if the tube sticks out a little bit here between the rim and the tire. And then when you inflate the tire, it gets pinched inside here, and then you end up with a flap once again after you've gone to the trouble of replacing it. So you want to basically go along here, pry back the tire, and make sure that you can't see the tube. The tube should be fully tucked inside your tire. So that's fine. We'll flip it around, make the same check. And again, it looks fine. I don't see the tube sticking out anywhere. And usually this isn't an issue, but you want to check anyways, because you'll have to pay for it if you do have a pinch flap. So now we could go ahead and inflate it, or we can put it in the bike first and then inflate it, which is what I'm going to do. So let's go ahead and do that. So our brakes are still disengaged, so this will come in pretty easily. Let's try that again. Alright, so I guess I just had to loosen this piece there a little more. So now that this is in, we can go ahead and hold this side while we tighten this side. And then once we've gotten that tight fairly well, we can push this down. And in this case, it's too tight that I can't even get this. So we'll loosen this side again. And you'll just want to keep doing that until you can actually press this down. Still a little too tight. All right. Let's see. Okay, so we're getting there now. A little tighter. Okay, so you usually want this lever here to be tight enough that you have to put in some force to get it there. But you don't want it to be so tight that you're really having to put in all your strength into it. So now that that is done, alright. So now that that is done, we'll go ahead and re-engage the brakes. So we can put this piece into the slot there. And now our brakes have been re-engaged. Oh, in this case, it looks like the spring was kind of messed up. Alright, so that should be better now. And then we'll want to make sure that the wheel is actually straight. So I didn't do a very good job. The wheel is a lot closer to this side. So I can just do that by loosening that lever again. And then tightening it. And that's one of the things that makes these quick releases kind of handy, is that you can just straighten the tire out pretty easily like that. So that is going good again. And we can just inflate this tire as normal. 60. Alright, so that is it for the tire replacement. Now we can go ahead and put the cab back on here. How are we doing on time?
We're at 41 minutes.
So we've got a little extra time. So one thing we can cover is taking off and putting on your pedals. This is something that you would need to do. If your pedal breaks, you need to put on a new one. Or maybe you just prefer a different type of pedal than what you have on yours. A lot of times, higher end bikes will even come with the pedals already taken off. Well, they'll come without pedals, that is, just because they expect the riders to have their own preference on which pedals they want to use, which pedals fit in with their shoes if they're doing flipped in pedals. But in this case, what we want to do is take this wrench. This is a pedal wrench, so it's specific to pedals. You can sometimes use a regular wrench, but it's recommended that you use the pedal wrench because it is made to be the right width to fit in here, and it also gives you a lot of leverage in the right direction. So once you've got that on, you can push as though you're pedaling forward while you keep this still. So we're going to pedal forward, and we just keep doing this. And then at some point, it's going to come off. And that's taking off the pedal. And then we'll go on to this side. And this side is actually reverse threaded, so it's not righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, as you'd normally expect. And that's kind of why when you do this, you want to always think about pedaling forward rather than which direction you're going to loosen. So we're going to pedal forward. Again, we're pushing down on both the wrench and the pedal. Sometimes these are pretty tight. Go around. And that's taking off the pedals. And so it's going to be basically the opposite operation to get them back on. So let's go back to the right side. Just do the opposite. And this is something that some people will even do if they're transporting bikes, just so that they don't have the pedals interfering with the other bikes and scratching up the frames or anything. But we'll get it lined up, and we won't even start with the wrench to begin with. We'll just do it by hand to make sure we're not putting it in incorrectly or anything. So before we had pedaled backward, or before we had pedaled forward, this time we're pedaling backward. And I want to make sure that I hold on to this part here, because if I just do this, the pedal's spinning and I'm not doing anything. So I hold on to here. Alright, now it's on far enough that I know it's going on correctly, so I can use the wrench. Keep pedaling forward. And getting it tight is sometimes difficult because people won't know which position to hold it in, but you want to hold it so that the crank or the pedal is going out this way, and then you can actually find which way is best to put on the wrench. So this is a comfortable way where I can really put my body weight into it and get it tight on there. So same thing on this side. And again, this is the reverse threaded one. But we'll just pedal backwards while we hold this. that's on. I'm just going to tighten it up some more. And I'm going to have to come over here to get a comfortable position. Put some force into it. And that is all good. Alright. I'm just about wrapped up here. One other thing we could talk about is handlebar positioning. So here at the front of the bike we have handlebars, and they're connected to the actual wheel, fork, and steering tube by this part here called the stem. And the stem has 2 bolts on the front. I'm going to bring the camera over. So it's got 2 bolts on the front. Sometimes this will have 4 bolts, a different configuration. And so this is good if you want to adjust your handlebars. So you can loosen these. And then you can adjust your handlebars. And obviously you're not going to adjust them this much, but you might want to make slight adjustments based on what is comfortable for you. So that's pretty simple. Not too much to talk about there. But another adjustment sort of in this region is the actual positioning of the handlebars versus the wheel. So if the handlebars are aligned with the wheel or if they're slightly offset. And this isn't something that you would adjust based on preference. This is something that should just always be adjusted so that your handlebars are straight with the wheel. But sometimes if you fall or you get into an accident or these just come loose, it'll actually be misaligned. And this can happen fairly commonly. And the reason it's not so obvious is because you have a bolt at the top here, and then you have 2 side bolts, which are the pinch bolts. So you always want to remember to adjust the pinch bolts anytime you're adjusting the orientation of the handlebars. So if I loosen these, now I can actually rotate the handlebars relative to the wheels. So you can imagine if you got into an accident and maybe it looks something like this, you would need to straighten that out. So you can check that it's straight and then tighten this back up. And some people assume that you tighten this one, but this bolt at the top, that's actually related to the set of bearings inside here, which is called the headset. And that's not something we're going to talk about today. So most of the time you're just going to be adjusting these unless you're trying to make changes to the tightness of the bearings, which we're not doing right now. So this is what we call a threadless headset versus some older bikes or some lower end bikes from today will have this type, which is different because we don't have these side bolts here. We've got a bolt on top, and then we have these big nuts here. So in this case, if we're going to do the adjustment we made on the last one, we actually are going to use this top one, and that's where it can get kind of confusing. So in here, these parts here adjust the tightness of the bearings, whereas this adjusts the orientation of the handlebars. So I'll show you that. So here we can see it's misaligned. And we can realign it, tighten it back up. All right. So that pretty much covers what we plan on talking about today. So if you have any of these problems, you can take what we taught you and try to put it into practice. Again, you probably don't have stands, but you can always find a way, either putting your bike upside down or just propping it up against the wall, and you can do, I think, all of the repairs that we talked about today, all of the maintenance. But if you have a problem that's not specific to what we talked about, it's always recommended that you do different research, or you just take it to a bike shop and see what they have to say. But thank you for being a part of this virtual workshop, and have a great rest of your day.